Hi, welcome back to my channel and part 2 of my journey through oddball sci-fi films that you may not have heard of or have been sidelined. They're not the best films ever made, but I think they're a lot of fun and they're worth your time. And today is a special UK edition. These are all films from Great Britain. Now, not the best sci-fi film, but a lot of fun. That is the product description for my first choice, which is Tobe Hooper's Lifeforce. Tobe Hooper, of course, is a famous American director. He made Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Salem's Lot, and Poltergeist, if you believe he directed Poltergeist. And here he came to England with a lot of money from Cannon, and he made this completely loopy adaptation of Colin Wilson's The Space Vampires, a title that tells you everything you need to know, right? Now, I'm going to try and talk through this film without mentioning Matilda May. Oh, I've done it now. Well, okay. Okay, she is very beautiful and she's very naked. You have to mention that, I'm sorry, because it's what is most famous about the film, right? But it's not just good for that reason. It starts out as a kind of alien type film where this space shuttle goes up towards Halley's Comet, and the space shuttle rather marvellously is called the Churchill because it's a mostly British crew. I quite like that detail. Anyway, it gets into this ship and it's full of giant bats and 3 beautiful humanoids who they take home, and then they turn out to be vampires and they run rampant. So it starts out as a full-blown sci-fi movie with quite good effects, actually. Then it becomes this kind of weird psychological warfare between the authorities and this female vampire. And then it turns into a full-blown zombie movie with London under attack by rampaging, decaying people with bloodlust. It's bonkers. It's absolutely lunatic. And all the way through it, there's these great British character actors trying desperately to look as if they know what's going on and failing miserably. Apart from Frank Finlay, actually, he keeps his cool. In the middle of it is Peter Firth, this young Peter Firth, who is supposedly the head of the SAS. Yeah, right. He really struggles in that role. But it's a lot of fun. You'll never know what's going to happen next. It's great fun. Now, speaking of Peter Firth, earlier in the 1980s, he'd appeared in 2 BBC plays, The Flip Side of Dominic Hyde and Another Flip for Dominic. Now, I remember watching these when I was a young teenager, and they really caught my imagination, but they've barely ever been spoken of since. And what they were a kind of gentle Douglas Adams, a kind of gentle Douglas Adams style romance, where this guy comes back in time from the year 2130 or something, and he comes back to early 80s London to look for his great-great-grandfather or something. He breaks the rules of time, and he falls in love. And it's very gentle comedy. It was quite unusual, though, for the BBC to do a play on this kind of subject, and I remembered it very fondly. It's been completely forgotten, though Network and BBC have put out this lovely little DVD. Actually, I think it's just BBC, not Network, okay? And I just wondered if anyone below in the comments would like to let me know if they remember this as fondly as I do. For me, at the time, it was as important as Hitchhikers. Hitchhikers took on more importance later, I admit. But it was I really liked this series, and I'd like to know if anyone else enjoyed it. The third film I'm going to look at today, this is a real oddball film, Unearthly Stranger. Has anyone heard of this? Has anyone seen it? This is an early 60s sci-fi movie. It's nowhere near as good as that poster, by the way. I'm sorry about that. And it's directed by a very interesting director, John Krish. Now, John Krish was known as a documentary maker, very good documentary maker. But Krish had a very strange career. He made sort of in-house movies for the British Army. One was about how to deal with being captured by enemy agents. Very interesting film, now released to the public. And he made that famous public information film where you're wandering around inside a gutted house after a fire. And he made another one, a very famous one, about kids playing on railway tracks. So he was a very, he did a lot of variety. Never became famous, but he was a very impressive director in whatever he did. And in the early 60s, he turned his hand to science fiction. And he made this movie, which stars John Neville, who I spoke about in one of my previous videos about Sherlock Holmes, a very good Sherlock Holmes. And this is a rare starring role for John Neville. The film is about, he's involved with this woman who we find out is an alien. And the way we find out that she's an alien is fantastic and could only happen in a British sci-fi movie. And what it is, she takes the casserole dish out of the oven without any gloves on. And this scientist goes, "Oh my God, She must have hands like asbestos. It's hilarious. Only in a British movie would that happen. It's an odd film. It's nicely directed. It doesn't really go anywhere. But it's well worth checking out. It's a real oddity. In '62, the American director Joseph Losey, who came to Britain because of the HUAC committee, the Un-American Affairs Committee, who's blacklisted as a communist, and he came to Britain and he became an honorary Brit director, very, very interesting director. I want to do a video about him later. And he made a science fiction film called The Damned. This is a very strange film. And you can see that they're promoting Oliver Reed's in it. Oliver Reed plays the leader of this gang of hoodlums, but they're not really the main story. The main story is that a group of kids are being put in this kind of think tank, this centre underneath the cliffs. I think it's set in Weymouth of all places. So under the seaside cliffs, they built this special secret base, and they are bringing up kids who are irradiated. So in the event of a nuclear apocalypse, they could survive and breed. And they're kept there and educated there. It's kind of like Village of the Damned style kids. And it's sort of, the storyline goes back and forth between this gang of hoodlums and this gang of kids. It's very odd. But it's actually quite impressive. It's got a very interesting atmosphere. It's a very interesting discussion, like Clockwork Orange, about the difference between violence and state violence. And it makes its point quite well. It's worth checking out if you've never seen it. It's an early film by Oliver Reed, and it's got an interesting cast. It's quite awkward and jagged, as Joseph Losey's films often are, but it's intriguing. Next up, Quatermass 4. Do people remember that there was a fourth one? Everyone knows the famous three ones from the 1950s, right? The Quatermass Experiment, Quatermass 2, and Quatermass in the Pit. Actually, Nigel Kneale was encouraged back in the late 70s by ITV, not the BBC, to make a fourth, and it's kind of forgotten. A lot of Quatermass fans turn their noses up at it. I rather like it. What is interesting about Quatermass 4, it's got a very powerful end-of-the-world atmosphere. But what it is, you know how we're used to all our fiction now being written by leftist liberals, aren't we? Looking at the ills of, capitalism or the state or dystopian authority and all this sort of stuff. Well, here is a rare example of a dystopian sci-fi written from the other point of view by a hardline, grumbly old conservative, which is what Nigel Kneale was. And he's sort of cocking a snook at, youth counterculture and hippies. They're bringing down the world, And what happens is that they gather at these kind of stone circles and these sites across the world, and they're harvested by this giant alien machine. It's like a sort of sacrifice to the gods. And Quatermass, as usual, is the only person who can see, the way that they've got to stop it. Quatermass is played by John Mills, never my favourite actor. He's really good as Quatermass, surprisingly good. And his sense of despair and fatigue is really powerfully evoked throughout the story. It's well filmed for its time. It's late 70s TV production. It's well filmed. It's got a true end-of-the-world feel about it. And if you can put up with Nigel Kneale's grumbly sort of anti-youth attitude, I think this is well worth seeking out. I think it's an interesting addition to the Quatermass cycle, and I rather like it. And finally for today, a more modern film, Under the Skin by Jonathan Glazer. Now, Jonathan Glazer is one of these directors who, media pundits like to call visionary, because he makes films that are a bit different. He made Birth with Nicole Kidman, where she's, looks like she's having some kind of queasy relationship with a young boy or whatever. In this film, Scarlett Johansson, a bit like Matilda May in Lifeforce, is very naked in it, and she goes around Glasgow and parts of Scotland picking up men. Sometimes they were actually members of the public. They had a hidden camera in back of Skojo's van, and she picked them up, and they had sort of improvised conversations, and some of them are actors. And she takes them back to this weird zone, this kind of twilight zone, where they sort of fall into this black pool, and they're looking up at her, and they get they're broken down into energy. It's a very strange movie. I think the first half of it is genuinely visionary and brilliant. visually and aurally extraordinary, with a wonderful score. I must tell you the name of the person who scored it, Mika Levy, I think her name is. It's an extraordinary score. The opening sequence is worthy of 2001 or any major science fiction film. And as you start with this sort of shaft of light and this point and this incredible urgent string music, and you realise you're watching the making of an eye, the kind of this creation of an artificial eye. It's an extraordinary sequence. I think the film breaks. Glazer doesn't really sustain it till the end. The last half hour is a bit obvious, and I think loses the visionary brilliance of the first half. But it's worth watching just for that first half. It's a rare modern film that rivals the past in terms of doing something original and different with science fiction. Okay, well, they're my choices. Let me know if there's any I've missed out or ones that you particularly think are sidelined but really interesting. And please like and subscribe. Thanks very much.